Artificial intelligence. Is it conscious? Can it make art? Will it take over the world? That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. So I remember the dawn of ChatGPT. I want to say it was in November of 2022. I think that's right. So when it first came out, and it seemed like when that happened, all that anybody could talk about was artificial intelligence. I'd get assailed with, links to the latest podcast that's discussing it, or an article that's exploring the possibilities of artificial intelligence or whatever it may be. And I think that obsession sort of died down after a little bit because, those questions seemed to stabilize. The world didn't suddenly become a post-apocalyptic wasteland. We weren't all of a sudden enslaved to an AI overlord or anything like that. And people seemed to retain their jobs. So over time, things just sort of got a little more even keel and AI would slip back into the background. But every now and then it resurfaces, right? You see this happen like in the film industry. Sora, I think is what it's called, is the sort of AI imaging, software that really does a pretty good job in doing a variety of things, generating footage that seems like it's, real footage, generating CGI style footage or whatever it is. And so that scared a lot of people in the film industry because it made them wonder, is this going to mean the end of our jobs as CGI artists? Is this going to mean that, all film from here on out is just going to be generated by AI? And then you also would have other things that, cause this topic to again resurface. For example, there was the recent announcement by Apple that they were going to go ahead and bring artificial intelligence, and I think it actually is ChatGPT, into all their devices. All right, and people were freaked out about that. And so again, what you'll see happen is that these questions that AI raises will come to the fore of the cultural mind, and then they'll sort of calm and dissipate, and then they'll resurface again, and so on. And so since we're in a point in this ebb and flow where it seems those questions are back, at the fore of the mind because of the recent Apple announcement, I figure I would go ahead and address some of the questions and concerns that naturally start to emerge when people are looking at the realities of artificial intelligence as it's being developed and used here today. And so what are some of those questions, right? There are obvious ones that are just practical, right? The questions of what does this mean for jobs, right? Are we all going to lose our jobs because AI is going to take over, every job in film and writing and research, whatever it is. And all of a sudden we're going to be living, what's the movie? Is it Wall-E? Where, all the people just sort of sit in chairs and get fat while they watch entertainment, all day long, every day, and machines handle everything. Is that where we're headed, right? Everybody's out of a job. There are those sort of practical economic questions. There's also these sort of ontological questions, right? Questions like, well, AI generates these images. Those images, are they art? Can AI create art? There's questions about consciousness. People are like, well, is it conscious? Like, is artificial intelligence really artificial, or is it actual intelligence? Right. And then there are some other more existential questions regarding the ramifications for humanity. So how I want to approach this is I want to start with two basic questions, right? The question about art and the question about consciousness. And then from those questions, I want to springboard into others that sort of naturally emerge along the way. So let's jump in. We'll start with the question about can artificial intelligence, can AI produce art? Now here, and I've talked about this before, for folks who follow my Substack, you can actually read my treatment of this topic. Just go to nathanajacobs.substack.com and search for the AI post. There you'll find, the sorts of things that I'm about to talk about here, but I've also talked about it on, I think I talked about it in my recent appearance on Paul Vanderklay as well. So anyway, but nonetheless, let's start there. I think what we need to do in order to answer this question, this is where metaphysics is really helpful, right? Because in order to answer the question of whether or not AI can produce art, we actually have to go into some of the metaphysics, some of the ontology, right? The nature being of art. What is it? right? And so let's lay that out. And by laying that out, we'll actually start to see what the answer is to that question rather clearly. Okay, so when we talk about art, okay, I'm going to take a realist approach to this, and that should be no surprise because anybody who watches this channel, right, anybody who listens to this podcast, you're very familiar with the fact that I am a realist. Okay, and so to avoid, redundancy ad nauseum on this topic, I'll just give the very quick overview, which is to say, when I say I'm a realist, what I'm talking about is this. The question of realism versus nominalism is a question having to do with the structures of mind. The mind looks out into the world. We see certain organizational patterns, genera, species, common properties. And the question is the mind apprehending something that is structurally real about the world? Out there, those structures are real. If you say that, you're a realist. Or are these mental inventions? And out there, the world is not really structured, right? You have structureless matter, but the mind needing to organize it starts to invent and impose certain structural patterns on the world. So these are really just names that the mind imposes on the world that are not really real. They're mental structures, not ontological structures, not out there in reality. If you say that, you are a nominalist, from the Latin nomen, because you're saying these are just names, right, that the mind invents and imposes on the world. So I am definitely a realist. And if you want a more in-depth treatment of that topic, I'd recommend my inaugural podcast, The Most Important Question, where I talk about the history of realism and nominalism and how it relates to things today. But for the purposes of this podcast, we'll just start with the fact that I am a realist. And so I'm going to give a realist account of art. Okay. So the word art actually indicates skill, like etymologically. That's what the word means. And so in terms of a realist account of what this means, I would take this sort of approach. You and I and every other rational being has a certain potentiality within us. We have a variety of potentialities grounded in our nature, right? So as rational beings, for example, you come into the world with the potential to learn language and to begin to speak, right? And through observation and hearing people and things like that, you begin to observe and you begin to develop that capacity. And that capacity for speech moves from a potential capacity, grounded in your nature as a rational being, to an actual capacity, right? Through repetition, through practice, through rehearsal, through interacting with others, you end up nurturing that potential into actuality so that you actually have it. It is now part of you that you have the capacity for speech, not just the capacity, you've actually cultivated speaking, right? You've cultivated language. You know that language and are able to articulate your thoughts through the use of language. Okay, now that is far from the only potentiality that you have as a rational being. Obviously, you have the capacity to do math and reasoning, and amongst those, you also have creative capacities. So you have the capacity to learn, say, the piano. You have the capacity to learn to draw, the capacity to learn to paint, something like that. And so those are all potential arts, right? Skills that are within you, in potentia, right? In the potential for those skills. And so let's say that you decide to learn to draw and paint, right? You can see, some of my artwork behind me that is actually drawing and painting is something that I did study. I studied at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. So let's say you begin to, through repetition, start to rehearse that, right? And you do it the way any child does. You see a cartoon and you're like, okay, that's cool. I'm going to take this pen and I'm going to try to imitate that cartoon drawing. And through repetition and observation and noting what you did wrong and how to fix it and things like that, you start to get better, right? Have that sort of skill set. And then we add to this that somebody comes alongside and they begin to teach you and they start to point out certain things that you don't quite understand that you're doing wrong. And they start to introduce to you certain details of technique and so on. And through practice, through guidance, through repetition, through trial and error over time, you begin to cultivate the art of drawing. So when we say the art, right, we are talking about that skill set that is being cultivated. So you move that from potential to actual. Now, if you've successfully done that, right, you have cultivated that skill set of drawing. You are now an artist with reference to drawing. And in this sense, the word artist refers to you as one who has cultivated that skill. So the skill is the art. You are the artist, the one who has cultivated it. It is now part of you in an ontological way. Now, this then moves into another nuance of the ontology of art, which is that as you begin to draw, this becomes the articulation of that skill set. Now, this is actually gets into a nuance between essence and energies. You can look at my interview with David Bradshaw that I did a while back, where we talk at length about the history of the distinction between the essence and energies. Now, we're talking about it specifically in a theological sense. But just the underlying philosophical sense of it really is recognizing that there is a difference between the underlying nature of a thing, right? What it is sort of in the abstract, in total, versus the articulation. So if we were talking about the fact that I have this skill, right? I am an artist. I have this skill to draw. And you said, well, okay, yeah, but what's that skill like? To what degree? To what measure? What type of drawing, right, are you skilled in, and so on and so forth. You would actually have to just look at the articulation of it. So the best way I could show you would be to begin to draw something. Now, the thing is, as I begin to draw, that particular drawing is only one small sliver of that skill set. Because let's say I do an anime cartoon or something like that. Well, that's not the sum total of what I can do, right? Because then I could switch over and I could do a charcoal portrait, and you'd be like, oh, okay, so this is a new dimension of that skill, and so on. And then maybe I move over into more of a Renaissance style drawing or something like that. And you start to see that and you say, oh, okay, so that's a further dimension of that skill set. This is why you could study a musician, right, like Bach, your entire life. Because what happens is every composition is a new articulation of his underlying genius and his skill set. And so each one gives sort of a new articulation of what's beneath it. And this is the distinction between the abstract essence of the thing, right, which is the total, it's the wellspring, unarticulated in the abstract, versus the particular articulation that comes out, right? Which, when it comes out, it has definite boundary lines in the ways that it's articulated. So when we're talking about an art, right, like drawing, what we're really talking about is, on the one hand, we have the art, which is the skill, right? The skill that was potentially within me, the skill that was in me in potentia, right? The potential for that skill that was moved into an actual skill set through repetition. I, as the artist, am the one who possesses that, right? That is now part of me, right? That's part of my inner being, right? My ontology. And then each drawing becomes an articulation of that cultivated skill set. And then the artifact, or the artwork, is the concrete manifestation, right? So that particular drawing that has come out through that act, right, through that operative power, that energy, right, that exercise of drawing, that activity, that articulation of the skill set, is what we call the artwork. That provides you a sort of basic structure, a realist structure, for thinking about art, right? When you talk about art, you're talking about the underlying skill. The artist is someone who, through repetition and work and so on, moved that skill from a potential skill within them into a concrete, actualized skill. The operative power is the exercise of that skill, or the energy of that skill, right, where it is articulated in a concrete act. And the thing that it produces is the artwork or the artifact. Okay, so there we go. We've got a basic structure on the ontology of art. And just as a sort of teaser here, I do intend on, at some point, doing at least one podcast on my philosophy of art as it relates to the history of art and the metaphysics of art and all that sort of stuff. So we'll get to that at some point. But for our purposes here today, that probably suffices. Because here, now when we look at AI, what we're talking about is, can AI generate art, right? Or more particularly, can it generate artwork, right? Because we're talking about the artifact, we're talking about the image that's produced. And my answer, quite simply, is no. AI can generate images, it cannot generate artwork. Now, one thing to be clear about, this is actually not a knock on the quality of AI images. AI images are very impressive. Incidentally, I know that there's a tendency to sort of poke fun at AI and be like, oh, yeah, look at how much, it has trouble with fingers, or why does that horse have 5 legs rather than 4? And, there's things like that that people will sort of take jabs at AI. Candidly, that always sounds to me like somebody who's a little freaked out and jealous because they're like, yeah, this thing's coming for all of us, right? The fact of the matter is, like, yes, AI has weird sort of defects in it, weird bugs like that right now, but those are going to get worked out. And the fact of the matter is, AI very effortlessly produces images that, in many ways, oftentimes are superior to the works of actual artists. I'll give you an example. H.R. Giger. He's an artist. Even if you haven't heard his name, you have seen his stuff, I guarantee you, because you've seen the movie, or at least seen the trailer for the movie Alien. Right. So if you're familiar with the Alien franchise, Alien, Aliens, Alien 3, Alien Resurrection, Prometheus, all this sort of stuff, right? That whole franchise, those aliens, are based on the artwork of H.R. Giger, right? So Giger started developing. He mainly works in airbrush, if I'm remembering right. So the images that he produces are these large airbrush paintings. And he developed a lot of those sorts of images, right? The images that you now associate with that film franchise, independent of that franchise, right? That was just the sort of artwork he imagined, right? These sort of weird, insect-like, skeletal, humanoid, sort of bizarre spaces and entities and things like that. And that was the sort of thing that Ridley Scott, when he was conceiving, how he was going to approach the Alien movies, H.R. Giger's artwork was the thing that he was like, we got to pull this guy in and use him in terms of the art team for designing the aliens and the environments and all that. And so much of the look of those film franchises, of that film franchise, is really thanks to Giger, right? Like, obviously, not to take credit away from Ridley Scott, but a lot of the look of the world is taken straight from the mind of Giger. Now, here's the thing: I've seen AI images generated to look like the work of H.R. Giger, and the fact of the matter is that on a certain technical level, they're actually superior to Giger's work. Here's why. So Giger's stuff, while it is haunting and weird and troubling, and you can't help but wonder whether he's channeling something from some other side of the veil when he's coming up with these images. The fact of the matter is, I can tell, as somebody who is skilled specifically in anatomy and the human form, I can tell that Giger struggles a little bit with realist humanoid representation, right? So you can tell that he struggles. He struggles with the human form in terms of getting it exactly right, but he can sort of mask that sort of deficiency in his skill set by really sort of leaning into these weird sort of humanoid-like images. And so, because the entities being produced are not strictly speaking human, he can kind of get away with hands that look a little weird, or, with a head that doesn't quite look right or whatever, because nothing looks right? It's all very distorted and weird and creepy and unnerving. And so the style and the concept ends up masking some of those deficiencies in his skill set. But the fact of the matter is, the AI generated stuff doesn't have those deficiencies. It ends up capturing all the weird creepiness of Giger, but with none of the deficiencies in terms of humanoid representation. So on that technical level, it's actually superior to Giger. But here's the question: is it art? Right? And the answer is no, because AI is not a intelligent being with the potential to cultivate a skill set who, through repetition and their exercise of reason and free will and observation and the rest, nurtured that potential into actuality and then articulated it in this image. None of that's true about AI. The image is not artwork in the sense of an articulated expression of an inward cultivated skill, right? It is a bit of technology that's capable of rendering images and of imitating certain things. And so, in this sense, AI does a very impressive job in representing, in generating images that are reminiscent of Giger, and even images that lack certain deficits within his skill set. But what it's generating is an image. It's not generating artwork because it is not an artist, because it doesn't have the skill of art, right? And so this is where ontology and metaphysics really matters, right? What are you talking about when you talk about art, or you're talking about an artist, or you're talking about their operative power, or you're talking about artwork, right? If you understand the underlying ontology of those terms, you can recognize, oh, that's not what AI is, right? AI is not an artist. What it's doing when it's generating this is not actually skill, right? And so what's being produced is not actually artwork. It's an image, right? It's an imitative, mimetic image. That's what it is. Now, I suppose I should add one caveat. Even though AI cannot create art, I could conceive of a way in which an artist can utilize AI as a tool. And in this sense, skill does come into it. So I could conceive of somebody becoming, gifted at, doing prompts with regard to AI, and then they bring in their own skill set, right? How do they utilize these in the editing process? How they start to throw their own sort of CGI and skill set on top of it, and so on. But that would be sort of an overlayer of artistic skill, on top of it. What AI is generating is actually not art. So I'll grant that caveat, right? That it's possible that AI could become a tool in the hands of an artist, but you would still have the distinction, right? What AI is doing is not art, right? It is a mimetic machinery, whereas what you have is art. Art and artists have everything to do with that underlying ontology that I talked about, right? The one who has cultivated that skill set, the articulation of that skill set, the artwork or artifact that is the concrete articulation of that skill set. Now, the reason I think this is useful is because it helps differentiate, images, sheer images, the sort of things that are produced by AI, from artwork. And I think that's actually really informative and useful as a way of sort of navigating some of these related questions, right? So one of the basic questions that starts to emerge with regard to AI are certain economic questions, right? And I'll say this, right? On the one hand, there are plenty of places where I think artists are not needed, even though they typically are the ones hired for certain jobs, or have been up until the dawn of AI, right? I'll just give an example, right? A billboard, right? Some advertiser needs an image to go up on a billboard that you see when you're driving past. Okay, do you really need an artist for that? I mean, honestly, probably not, right? The advertiser may be accustomed to going to an artist who is going to use some sort of skill set like photography or graphic design or even painting or whatever it may be. But, now with AI, maybe they don't need an artist to do that, because at the end of the day, there is a certain utility to it, right? They're not commissioning the artwork for the sake of art, right? They're commissioning an image. That's what they care about. It has a certain utility for, something that's up there to grab your attention and convey some sort of message or advertisement, whatever it may be. And in that sense, I think there's there should be an acknowledgement that that basic utility, it's actually okay that AI replaces the artist in that case because it just becomes economically, it becomes something that, you know, uh, artist, AI, image, artwork, the fact that it is artwork being produced isn't actually really relevant. Now, I suppose you could have a company that just, just like they support certain other types of, they give donations or they support other certain types of businesses or whatever it may be. You could have a company that for altruistic reasons, they say, well, we value humanity and we value artists, so we're going to hire an artist to do this. But at the end of the day, is an artist needed for that? No, because the billboard isn't actually, its purpose is not ultimately to be a vehicle for art, right? It has a very different purpose that AI can actually fulfill and can fulfill in an economic way. And so, in this sense, the role of AI becomes perfectly acceptable. It becomes a more economic option available to somebody an advertiser who's looking for an image that they might throw up on a billboard. It sounds like I'm saying throw up, right? And maybe that is a Freudian slip having to do with AI, but it's really not. No. I mean, I'm just saying, like, they just need to put something up there as an image. Now, this of course naturally raises that economic question. Does this mean that all of a sudden graphic designers all go away and artists all go away and things like that? I'm going to suggest that artists don't go away, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But I will say this. In terms of the economic question, here is something I would actually advocate. And I don't know how much the AI or consumers of AI will appreciate this, but I think the artists will. I actually think that AI, rather than artists sort of resisting AI in the production of images, right? Not the production of artwork, because they can't produce that, but in the production of images, I think artists shouldn't resist it. They should lean into it. And I think the best economic way forward in terms of how to handle the ramifications of AI is this. AI is ultimately mimetic, right? It is an imitative, sort of programming. What it does is it learns, it observes, if that's even the right term, since it's not conscious or intelligent. We'll get back to that. But it analyzes certain images, right? Certain patterns and things like that. And then it's able to imitate those, right? So that's the nature of what AI does. And for that reason, what I think should happen is I think two things would be the best way forward economically in terms of the economic question. I think artists should voluntarily offer their artwork to AI companies. So, for example, if people like my artwork, right, they like my style, they should be able to go to a certain AI company and say, I want, in the style of Nathan Jacobs, I want this kind of illustration or this kind of image or whatever it is. And I think what should be a viable option is that I go ahead and I offer to that company my artwork. And I say, here's my entire portfolio. Let your AI analyze it and start to imitate me, right? But here's the thing. Now I should also get a commission, right? So the fact of the matter is that by voluntarily offering up my my intellectual property, right? My skill sets, right? These things that I have cultivated that really are an extension of me, and offering that up to the AI, I am licensing that to the company so that the AI can analyze and imitate it. And that way people can, for a more efficient rate, come and utilize my stuff. So let's say, for example, in the film industry, they want to do concept art and they want Jacob style concept art. Well, it's true. I'm going to lose business to AI because you don't need an artist to do concept art, not necessarily, right? This is sort of a sales tool. You're trying to offer to people a glimpse into what your film might look like, how you might conceive these worlds, and so on. And so, if, for example, Alien was being made back in the day when, before Alien, the first Alien was launched, if Ridley Scott had access to AI and said, you know what? AI, generate for me some images in the style of H.R. Giger, right? Give me a spaceship that looks like H.R. Giger made it. Give me a creature that looks like H.R. Giger, designed it. AI would be able to do that. And I think that would be a very efficient and effective way to start to get some concepts moving within the film industry, right? To get a concept ready in order to sell it to a studio. But I think H.R. Giger should be compensated for that. So it's one thing for an industry to say, we think it is more cost effective to have AI generate this image because what we're doing is we're not making art, right? Now, again, I'm put aside for a minute that I brought up film, and I think film actually is an art form and so on, but let's just put that aside for 1 minute. They're just saying for the sake of, this concept art, this is just part of a sales package, right? We're going to go in and we're going to pitch a concept. We've got a movie story idea, and we just need to sort of like give some images to get people excited so they can sort of imagine the world. And so, yeah, we'll get artists involved at some point, but right now, just to like put together the sales package, we don't need artists involved. We're just going to tell the AI, to imitate H.R. Giger and so on. I think that would be perfectly acceptable because they're acknowledging that what they're doing is not art. They just need images, right, for sales purposes. But I still think H.R. Giger should be compensated for that because the tool is imitating him. And for this reason, one of the ways in which I would approach the economics of the sort of imitative nature of AI is that I think AI should be required to divulge its source material. And in this sense, I think what should happen is once that is laid bare, anybody that it imitates, it should have to compensate. And here's the thing. If you watch my episode on cultural appropriation, right, I talk about the nature of rights. And one of the things that I talk about with regard to rights is I talk about this sort of ontological underpinning of rights, right? The idea that your underlying nature is part of what gives you a right to do certain things. And I also talk about the relations, the real and natural relations that emerge, like between a parent and a child that sort of ground certain types of rights. Well, the relationship between me and my artwork is a real relation, right? The fact that it is my skill that's been cultivated, the fact that that is my style that was cultivated, the fact that that's my artwork, I actually do think it's a violation of my rights if AI starts to imitate it. And so this is one of the reasons why I think the way in which you protect artists and you make a fair economic sort of handling of the AI realities is that AI needs to be transparent in terms of what it's looking to for its mode of imitation. And anything that it's looking to that, still has some sort of copyright protection or whatever it may be, actually needs to be compensated. So if the AI starts to imitate my artwork, it needs to actually compensate me because that belongs to me, right? That's actually mine. I worked to cultivate that skill set. That is my own imaginative and creative work that it's looking to and it's imitating. So that's fine. You don't have to pay the same amount you would if I did a painting because, right, it's, it's less laborious, right? In fact, it's not laborious at all. You typed a prompt, imitate Nathan Jacobs, right? But I should be compensated something because ultimately AI is drawing on my stuff in order to generate those images. And so that's where I think, looking at the ontology of these things really helps, right? Because what it does is when we start to look at the ontology of it, we can answer the question, is AI producing art? No. Am I producing art? Yes, right? I'm producing artwork. And then for that reason, do I have certain rights of ownership over the artwork I produce? Yes. If AI imitates it, should I actually be owed something because I have a right over those sort of creative resources that AI is now fracking? And I think the answer is yes. So look at that, right? Metaphysics and ontology offering insights on questions related to economics and intellectual property and all that sort of stuff. Crazy, right? Crazy. But yeah, it's true, right? Looking at the underlying ontology and the metaphysics of something like art actually does illuminate the boundary lines of certain things, like whether or not AI creates art versus a human being who creates art. And then what sort of rights does an artist have, and how do we adjudicate in a fair manner, in a just manner, that honors the sort of underlying ontology and the rights of the artist and things like that, these new realities, these new economic realities that we're going to step into with regard to AI. It actually does, have a usefulness in a variety of areas, just beyond, talking about the nature of reality itself. Okay. Now, one of the things that this also opens up the door for is it opens up an important question about the value and the role of art, right? Because if art is something that AI can't take over, right? AI can't produce art. Now we get into this territory of differentiating, like, what is it that you're really looking for? So let's take, for example, music, right? There are plenty of people who consume music just because it's entertaining, right? They just want something to dance to. They just want something to entertain them while they're on their drive or whatever it may be. But there does start to emerge a very real question about the difference between sort of a mere sort of musicality, right? If that's even right to call it that. Um, the mere melody, right, versus art, right? So I'm sure we could have AI generate for us something that sounds similar to Bach, right? It could analyze certain aspects of, Bach's, compositions, and start to come up with generate some sort of sounds that are going to sound very much like, Bach might have composed them, reminiscent of him, right? It could imitate something like that, just like it can imitate, H.R. Giger. But now the question becomes, why are you listening to Bach in the first place, right? Are you just listening to Bach because you just want something in the background while you write, or while you do laundry or whatever, right? Like, is that why you're listening to Bach? More importantly, should that be the reason you're listening to Bach, right? Or is there actually some other layer of value that's there in listening to Bach, namely that he is a creative genius, right? And this is where I think it's rather important to start to revisit and think about the real value of art, right? So whether you're talking about the art of storytelling, or you're talking about the art of painting and drawing, or the art of sculpting, or you're talking about the art of music, right? All of these things, on the one hand, they have sort of been reduced to entertainment for a lot of people. But on the other hand, it raises the question of whether they should be. And I'm inclined to think the answer is they should not be. So I'll be candid. I rarely listen to music. And the reason is because when I listen to music, I want to listen to it with intent. I recognize that somebody like Bach, he took the time to not just cultivate this skill set and cultivate it at such a high level that very, very, very few people in the history of humanity could have or would have, right? And that when you're listening to his compositions, what you're listening to is the expression, right? The articulation of that extreme skill set. And that is filled with truth and goodness and beauty. In many ways, what you're getting is you're getting through Bach an echo of the mind of God, right? You are getting this articulation. Him as an icon of God has cultivated certain skill sets that are unique to humanity. And in doing that, he is in many ways channeling and expressing and articulating certain very high level attributes of God himself. And to treat that in some ways like junk food, right? To treat it as something that's just there to, distract you while you're doing laundry seems irreverent almost, actually. It seems inappropriate to the thing. This is the sort of thing that actually demands attention, right? It's the sort of thing that demands you to really give yourself over to it and truly appreciate it as best you can. And so when I approach music, I actually try to approach it intentionally. Try to approach it intentionally, first of all, because I recognize when I'm talking about art, when I'm talking about music in the sense of being produced by an artist, right? I'm talking about artwork. I also recognize that it's potent, right? It produces certain emotions. And I want to be careful about toying with something that can manipulate my passions, that can manipulate my mindset and my mood and things like that. And so, in this way, there is a world of difference between, say, junk food and real nourishment with regard to art. Um, would I have an opposition to the ideas that I just want noise in the background of some kind that is a little distracting? So I had AI generate something that's kind of Bach like and it sits there in the background. I mean, I'm not sure I would actually advocate that. I think we should get, more accustomed to silence and being focused on the things that we're doing than we are. But if you wanted that, sure, you could treat what AI generated as junk food because it kind of is, right? It's not really art. Um, but Bach shouldn't be treated that way. And in this sense, what I would like to see is I would like to see, AI and the reality that AI is presenting to us cause people to begin to revisit and rethink what the real value of art is, right? When we think about artwork in a space, um, part of the question is, what is it doing? Do we just want an image that's hung on the wall? Let's say something that looks like a painting, right? So we have AI generate something that looks like a painting, and it pulls together the room pretty well because it's got the right sort of color schemes and things like that. And we don't really care if it's art. I suppose that is one way of handling things. But there's a real question of whether or not the aesthetics of a room are such that there is some sort of benefit to you as a human being to encounter beauty, right? To encounter a certain type of harmony. Does that in some way affect you and elevate you and produce well being? I'm inclined to think it actually does. And for that reason, when you're considering how you surround yourself, right, how you generate a space and what the potential role of art is, I'm inclined to think you don't just want images. You actually should want art, right? And now, in this sense, we're talking about something that, again, it's the difference between, say, Bach, which actually is an articulation, right? This is a manifestation of someone who is an icon of God, right? An image of God, having cultivated these potentialities and brought into being, right? These articulations, these expressions of certain attributes that are unique to God, and putting it out there in the world for your benefit, right? To elevate you through the hearing of it, through the encounter with it, versus junk food, right? Just sort of noises that sound kind of like that. And in a similar way, when you're talking about artwork in a certain space, right? It seems that you don't just want images. Similarly, within a church, right? Think about the ways in which artwork, right, originally was produced for these sacred spaces. Now, this is a much longer discussion, this particular one, and I talk about this on the PBS show Closer to Truth. If you look up Closer to Truth, you'll see that I did a bunch of appearances and interviews with them, and I talk about sort of religious artwork. And I talk about the fact that there's a difference between just images and sacred things that have been blessed and set apart. But let's put aside for a moment that difference, right? Just between a work of art versus an icon, right? To use sort of an orthodox distinction, and just talk about the fact that within a sacred space, this actually is an act of devotion. You have all of these artists, right? Architects, painters, sculptors, all coming together in order to create this space, devoted to God, that's meant to be conducive to worship and things like that. And a big part of this is not just the manifestation of those skill sets, it's the manifestation of those skill sets, the devotion of those to God, the high teleology of worship and so on, in order to create this sublime space that's meant to elevate the worshiper and so on and so forth. If somehow you had, AI that just sort of generates a temple, right? And there it is. There would be a major loss. Even if it looked exactly like it, you would end up losing a significant piece of the ontology. I think it was in the Paul Vanderklay interview where I talked about this. I talked about the idea that let's just say we had an AI device, and we probably do, to be honest, right, that could scan Michelangelo's Pietà, right? And then in scanning it, it's got a 3D model of the Pietà exactly as it is, right? Every inch of it. And that somehow, this laser device, whatever it may be, is able to carve out and like chisel stone and make this perfect replica, stone replica of the Pietà, right? The question would be, are those the same? And the answer is no, they are not the same. One is a work of art because it is the articulation, the artifact, the manifestation, the artifact of Michelangelo's creative genius, and the other one is not, right? So even though all the material details about the two are identical, right? Every square inch, you wouldn't even be able to tell them apart. One is actually artwork and the other is not. And that's related specifically to the underlying ontology. The fact that the one was produced by Michelangelo's hand as the outward expression, as the articulation of the art that he had cultivated, and the other one is not. And so these relational properties are really important because what they begin to highlight is they begin to highlight the deficit of the sort of empiricist, materialist worldview, right? So in my temple analogy, the fact of the matter is, even if those two temples looked exactly the same, right? AI was somehow able to generate and produce a temple filled with, what seemed to be, paintings and sculptures and all this sort of stuff. And it looks identical to the other one that artists spent, 100 years making. But the AI was able to make this in a day, right? Whatever it is. There would be significant differences between those, even though you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. And the differences would have to do with the underlying ontology. The difference would have to do with that part of the sublimity of the original one, the one made by human beings, is that it is a manifestation of certain skill sets, right? So there is something sublime about the creative genius of Michelangelo. There's something sublime about the creative genius of Bach, something that manifests something, an attribute that is an imitation, a small imitation of God. And in the sense that it is so impressive, right? So overwhelming that you feel humbled in the presence of it, right? It's sublime. That's so in the same way when you have a temple like that, and if you've ever stepped into, like, I don't know, the Strasbourg Cathedral or something like that, you have this experience where you look and you realize there are hundreds of artists working over years and years and years to produce this, and it is awe-inspiring. And it's awe-inspiring not just because of the material facts, not just because of the material realities that descriptively give you certain aesthetic principles, but because of the relational property. The fact that the sculpture is the manifestation of a skill set of a sculptor, right? The fact that that painting is the manifestation, the articulation of a specific painter who has cultivated that high level of skill set. The fact that that building was designed by an architect who has studied certain architectural principles and utilized that genius in order to develop this space and so on. AI doesn't do that. So again, similar to the Michelangelo analogy, even though the material facts seem to be identical so much that you wouldn't be able to discern them, there are relational properties, real properties that are relevant to the nature of the thing, that contribute to its sublimity, right? That contribute to what is awe-inspiring about it, that in the one side, is real, and on the other side is completely lacking. And this is, incidentally, this is part of the reason, this is one of the many reasons I am a realist. And I think realism is quite relevant to a proper understanding of, well, reality generally, but also these sorts of issues in particular. And I think once you start to see this, right, you start to recognize that there is some sort of something reductionistic about the empiricist materialist type impulse, right? Think, for example, about, let's say, AI and food. Can we have AI start to generate food? I'm sure we could start to have, and we probably already do. I think in Japan, they've already got, like these AI machines that handle, fast food or something like that. And so, could you have AI be programmed in such a way that it's able to handle your cheeseburger and get you something that's cooked just right, exactly the way, you want it, every time? Sure. But just like with other forms of art, there's something that's lacking about that, right? Because amongst the many things, once you understand what art is, right? Once you've defined art in the realist terms that I have, right? Art, artist, artwork, there's a real sense in which you recognize, yeah, it's true. Gordon Ramsay, for example, is an artist. I'm presuming here, right? I've never eaten at one of his restaurants, so I don't know for sure, but I'm presuming based on reputation and things like that he is an artist, right? So he has cultivated a certain skill set with regard to cooking and with regard to food, and then the food itself is an articulation of that. That relational property goes away when you're talking about a machine that generates a burger, right? Something like that. And in this sense, I think what this distinction, right, between AI producing, images, for example, versus artwork, that type of a distinction starts to open the door to, well, what is it that we really want when we imbibe a meal, right? Is it that you just want, nutrients? Is it that you just want something that tickles your palate? Maybe, right? Just like there are people who want to drive in their car and just have something to sort of dance to, and they don't care whether a human generated or not. They don't care whether it's art or not, or they just want noise in the background while they do laundry. Like, sure, I'm sure there are people who are like, yeah, I don't care whether or not some human being made this food or not. I just care that, it tickles my taste buds. Sure, there's definitely that. But there's a real question of whether or not that perspective itself is deficient. And we really should revisit certain things like that. I mean, think about, for example, the ways in which there are so many people who have memories of their mother's cooking, right? They grew up with, or specific meals that their mothers made and things like that. On the one hand, like, yes, that may be an assessment of the quality of the food that was made. On the other hand, there's a host of other things that are going on there having to do with the fact that that is your mother, right? The fact that she cares for you, the fact that that is made with love, right? There's sort of like that common, well, it's not really a meme, but the common saying that like the secret ingredient is love. Well, that actually matters, right? In some ways, because when somebody actually does go ahead and they utilize their skill set of cooking in order to feed you, right? There's something relationally happening there in terms of their own, right, skill sets, the production of this food, what it is in relation to them, and them offering it to you that isn't there in a pure manufacturing sort of way. Think about this also with regard to stories, right? Within the film industry, for example, I know that there's a lot of questions about whether or not AI might replace writers at some point. And again, this sort of thing where people joke, well, I've seen the scripts that AI generated and they really suck and whatever. Okay, that's fine. And, let's say it takes a while for AI to catch up on the storytelling front or whatever. But again, in a very similar way, there's a real question of when you engage in listening to a story, what is the purpose, right? Do you want to engage in this merely as entertainment, right? Is it just something to pass before your eyes and, produce certain feelings in you before you go on and do the next thing? Just like everything else, right? Is this just wasted time? Right? Is this just tickling my taste buds or tickling my ear or tickling my eye or, whatever it may be? Is that what you're looking for? Or does storytelling have a deeper value? A deeper value having to do with an engagement in conversation, reasoning with another person, an exploration of values or of questions, right? allowing another person, stepping into another person's worldview, letting them take you on a journey, things like that. Those sorts of relational realities of what story does, those sorts of relational possibilities of what a storyteller does, cannot be replaced by AI. So once you recognize these sorts of ontological realities underneath the question of art versus image, for example, AI versus an artist, what you begin to see is that what comes to light is another round of questions, which has less to do with AI and it has more to do with you and me, right? And that question about you and me is whether or not there has emerged within us, right, within our culture, a tendency to mistreat art, right, to take it for granted. And here, what I mean is something like this: story is a very potent tool, right? And it is a tool that has the power to raise questions about ethics, to teach morality, to elevate our thinking about things divine, right? To instruct us about human relationships, right? To move us in a variety of ways. And the question is, that very powerful artwork, right? That very powerful art, right? The art of storytelling, is that something that we have begun to treat in a gluttonous, hedonistic fashion, where we no longer really care about what the proper end of that art is? We only care that the next 2 hours goes by really quick while I lay on the couch, right? And so for that reason, binge watching, right? And once you start to think about that art, right, the art of storytelling in that sort of way, now all of a sudden you open the door for a certain gluttonous, hedonistic tendency that says, yeah, I don't care if AI generated it or a storyteller generated it, because I'm not really engaging it the way I ought. I'm not treating it with the level of dignity or with the sort of proper end in mind. I'm just treating it as a mode of entertainment to make the time pass quickly, right? But the fact of the matter is that may not be how you should treat storytelling, right? Similarly, when we think about cooking, am I just a hedonist glutton, right? Where all I want is I just want to eat something that tickles my taste buds, as opposed to recognizing that what I really want is I want something that is a work of art, right? That is some way an articulation of a skill set by a certain person who, let's say it's, a parent or something like that, who cares about you. And in this sense, there is something in it being offered to you in the relational interaction that is actually much more elevated than what it does to your taste buds, right? Or similarly, when you go and you visit a restaurant that you really want to go and experience the artwork of a certain artist. So that's why you go to Gordon Ramsay's restaurant, because what you're looking for is an experience to actually experience this high level skill set, right? This high level art that humanity is capable of. If that's what you're doing, right, then AI can't replace that. Similarly, if you're thinking about, well, beautifying your home, am I just looking for a certain color scheme that kind of works, right, in an analytic sense? Or am I looking to surround myself with things that are filled with beauty, that are articulations of skill sets by icons of God who have cultivated, right, this skill set in a way that manifests certain divine attributes in these small articulated ways that, only an icon of God can produce, right? Only an artist, right, a true artist can produce. If you're looking for that elevated sense of, aesthetics, right, that elevates you, right, by participation, then, that's something that AI cannot produce, right? And so I think what happens here is that rather than AI causing us to go into crisis and think about, what's going to happen to everybody's jobs, the first question is, what has happened to us as consumers, right? What has happened to us as a people who cease to appreciate these things and just consume them as if they are nothing more than something that tickles the taste buds or tickles the eye or passes the time. And so I think if we begin to recognize that there actually is a difference between, say, just an image and artwork, there is a difference between AI and an artist, then what we can begin to do is we can not only recognize that difference, we can begin to rethink how we tend to engage a lot of the things that we consume. And if we actually do rethink and reorient ourselves, right? We don't just want something to flash before the eyes to pass the time. We want a story from a storyteller, right? An artist. Then we don't want AI movies. Maybe some people do, right? Just like they don't care whether or not the music they listen to is AI or a real person. But a lot of us might begin to reorient ourselves and say, you know what? I actually don't think as a human being that is the way I'm supposed to consume things. I actually think music is supposed to be consumed not just for mere entertainment. I think it's supposed to be consumed as art, as an elevated expression and articulation of a human artist. And AI can't replace that. And so that's why I'm going to reorient how I approach music. I don't think images, right, artwork in the sense of painting or drawing or something like that, is just about the image. Yes, on the one hand, the image is an important part of it, but an important part of it is that it is an articulation. It is the artwork of an artist. And so there's something about the fact that this is a cultivated skill set of an individual being articulated. And so I don't just want an image produced by AI. I want artwork, right? I don't want to engage in music where it's just noises in the background while I do laundry. I actually want to be intentional about consuming the genius of a certain songwriter, right, or composer or something like that. And I think if we begin to rethink how we consume those sorts of things, what you would see is there's actually quite a few things in our culture that even though AI could step into a pure consumerist culture and replace, if we were actually properly oriented, there'd be far less things that AI could replace. I really don't think AI should be able to replace music. I really don't think AI should be able to replace chefs. I really don't think AI should be able to replace painters and drawers. I really don't think AI should be able to replace storytellers. And I'm not, in saying that, offering an indictment of the quality of the image produced. As I said with Giger, right? I think the AI Giger imitation actually is superior in certain technical ways. But the difference is it's not art, right? And so I think the real reason that AI is such a threat is not actually because of AI. I think the reason AI is a threat is because of you and me. I think it's because we have ceased to engage in these arts, right? We have ceased to engage and consume art the way it is meant to be. We have come to be mere consumers of music, mere consumers of artwork, mere consumers of story, and so on. And the fact that consumerism is the thing that has opened the door for saying, well, who cares if a real person did it? Because at the end of the day, we're not engaging it as art. We're engaging it as mere tantalization, right? And I think that's wrong. And so my hope would be through thinking through AI and reassessing as a result these questions, right? These very sorts of questions that say, is it art, is it not? We might actually feel the prick of the indictment and begin to reorient the way in which we engage. And in that sense, what you'll see is, yes, there's room for AI. There are times when an image is just an image, it's what you need, it doesn't have to be artwork. But there are a lot of things that AI is presently threatening to replace that it really, really shouldn't replace if the consumers of those things consume them in a way that is suitable to what they really are. Stories should not be mere entertainment, right? Music should not be mere noise. art shouldn't be mere colors on the wall. And that is the real shift that I think needs to occur, not with the AI, but with you and with me and how we approach these things that AI currently threatens to replace. So there we go, right? We have our answer to our first question, whether or not AI can produce art. And then in exploring that, we've not only gotten sort of a baseline understanding of art and artist and artwork, but we've even offered some, insights into potential economic solutions and the limitations of what AI can actually offer. Well, limitations are really set largely by you and me, and whether or not we're willing to reorient how we approach things like music and storytelling and artwork and the rest. Are we willing to sort of reorient ourselves and treat them properly, or do we just sort of want to exist as mere consumers who are just hedonistically looking for things to tickle our senses? And that's kind of up to us. It's not really up to AI. But let's go into this other question that sometimes emerges, right? The question of whether or not AI can become conscious, right? That's one of the things that emerges a lot. Is it conscious? Could it become conscious? Might it become self-aware? All those sorts of things. So speaking as a metaphysician and a realist, I'll answer candidly, which the answer is no. It is not and cannot be conscious. I think what's going on here is two things. Right. The question emerges largely because of a feature of human epistemology. How do you know that you know that you know? And the way that's paired then with a sort of causal issue that has to do with essence and energies, which I mentioned earlier. So here's the thing. Like you and I, the Eastern Church Fathers talk about this a lot, right? Basil of Caesarea in one of his letters talks about the fact that we actually don't peer into the fabric of reality and see the nature or the essence of the thing in the abstract. What happens is we encounter the energies or the operative powers, the articulations or expressions of the nature, and from that we infer the underlying nature. So let's use some examples. And say we land on a planet and we meet a species of thing and we're like, is it intelligent? Right? Well, the fact of the matter is we can't just peer into the head of the thing that we encountered and say like, oh, yep, I see intelligence in there. Yep, that's in there, right? You don't see the sort of vague floating sort of intelligence. You don't see the mind in the abstract. Rather, just like with you or with me, how I know that you have a mind is that I begin to see it articulate itself. You begin to speak. You begin to reason, right? You begin to articulate your thoughts. And so what happens is the reason I believe that there are other minds in the world, minds other than mine, is not because I actually ever perceive the mind directly, right? And, lest you conflate brain and mind, yes, cutting open a head and seeing the brain is still not seeing the mind. You're seeing the instrumental means of by which the mind operates, which is, the brain, but you're not seeing the mind itself, right? The mind is intangible. It's inaccessible to you. And so you come to believe that other people are intelligent and have a mind because you hear them talk, you hear them reason, right? You encounter the operations or the operative powers that express mind out in the world. And from that, you make an inference, right? Now, that epistemological limitation is what occasions this question, right? Because what happens is we have that limitation paired with our ability to imitate certain operations creates the possibility of false judgment. So let's put aside AI for a minute, right? Let's do a scenario where you and I decide to go into business because we want to create some fake fireplaces, right? And what we do is we're able to create this holographic image, right? This 3D holographic image that, you can walk all the way around it and it dances and it flickers and it shoots off light and all the rest. And it looks just like fire. And you're like, looking at it, man, I would think that's really fire. And then we're also able to, create this sort of, this heating system that it doesn't just put off heat, right? Like it puts off heat in a way that mirrors the way the hologram does, right? So the way it generates it actually imitates the ways in which fire, radiates heat. And so you're sitting there, you're going like, wow, And let's say that the heater is not just heating, right? Internal, like core temperature, right? The deeper you go into the flame, it actually can cook things, right? So the heating, processes are actually enough that you could cook, a piece of meat inside the flame just like you would within fire and so on. And so basically what we've done is we've started to create such an impressive imitation of fire that to the senses you'd go, it's fire, right? Like if I didn't know that you guys had produced holograms, if I didn't know heat and I walked up to it and I was like, yep, that looks like fire. And my hand's getting close to it and feels hot. And I take a hot dog and I put it on a stick and I put it in there and it's roasting it. Like, yep, it's fire. And I would make that judgment. And the fact of the matter is, though, the judgment is wrong. So our hologram might be so good, right, that basically when you look at it, right, everything about it, from what you can tell, it's fire, right? And it wouldn't be crazy for you to infer that, right? Because you're sitting there looking at it and saying, well, the way the light is dancing, right? The way it gives off heat, the way it cooks things, all of that, yep, definitely fire. And what you'd be doing is you'd be inferring from those surface level operations the underlying ontology. But the fact of the matter is, you and I, when we developed that holographic technology, we didn't make fire, right? What we did is we imitated the externalities, the operations, the articulations of fire such that we can trick your senses. But no matter how close we make those those articulations mirror real fire, we still haven't made fire. What we've made is a hologram, right? And this is, I think, what's going on with regard to AI. People are sort of weirded out for the same sort of reason, because they're looking at AI and they're saying it's imitating certain things that I typically associate with reason, right? I infer that there is mind underneath here because there's certain responses, because there's certain inference, because there's certain rationality, because there's certain interactions or whatever it may be. And those various expressions of mind are the things that tell me there's a mind underneath. So in a similar sort of way, what they're wondering, right? What the question about consciousness is all about is saying, well, what if this gets so close to a human mind in the way that it interacts with me that I really can't tell the difference? Have they actually produced mind? And the answer is the same in our holographic fire. No, they haven't, right? What they've produced is they've produced an imitation, right? They've produced a machine that's able to imitate all the things that cause you to infer mind underneath, but they haven't made mind. In the order of nature, energies are actually produced by the underlying nature, right? We have a mind, and that mind has the potential to cultivate intelligence, right? To cultivate rationality, to cultivate language and all the rest. And then those are an outgrowth of that. What's happening in terms of the ontology of AI, you don't have mind, right? You have a machine, right? And the machine is being trained. It's being programmed and trained in order to imitate the things that you typically use to infer mind. But it is not a mind. And so that's where I think what's going on is there is an epistemological flub happening, right? Where we are so accustomed to inferring from the externalities, the underlying nature, that when the externalities come a little too close to, externalities of mind, there emerges the question, is there really mind underneath it? But just like in the case of our holographic fire, the answer is no, right? The underlying ontology, we know what it is. It's a machine, right? It is not actually a mind. It's just that it is a machine that's capable of producing externalities that are so similar at some point. Right now, obviously, you can tell when you're chatting with a bot, right? But at some point, the question is, might we get to a point where the externalities are so similar to human mind that I don't know when I'm chatting with a bot and I don't know when I'm chatting with a real human being? And if that were to happen, would it be conscious? And the answer is no, because the underlying ontology is still machine, right? It's just that the externalities are such, the limitations of your epistemology, the fact that you don't peer through reality to the underlying nature, are such that your senses can be tricked. But that doesn't change what the underlying ontology is. right? The underlying ontology, the energies, the operative powers, are the energies and operative powers of a machine, not of mind. Now, there is a danger, though, of this impression of intelligence. And there's a couple of different dangers here. And these are where I think we're getting into the real dangers of AI. I actually don't think the real dangers of AI are inherently economic. As I said, I would like to believe that those sorts of differences between real art and AI generated images, or real art and AI generated music, if it really is to be called music, melodies maybe. My hope is actually that what that will do is serve as a corrective for us rethinking how we approach and consume things like music and story and art and all the rest. That's my hope, and I might be wrong, and we all end up in the sort of a Wall-E scenario, but that would be my hope. I don't think those are the real, most insidious dangers of AI. I think the real dangers of AI, really are located in the fact that it has the appearance of intelligence. And here's why. AI is not intelligent. It is artificial intelligence, right? It's imitating intelligence. And the fact of the matter is, AI has deep and abiding biases. Now, I know this because when ChatGPT, yes, there's been all sorts of, different stories that have come out where people have exposed biases, right? They've gotten, the underlying code to expose itself and demonstrate that it has certain sort of unprompted prompts, built into it, or that people have pointed out the ways in which, chat, will generate certain responses that divulge political biases or whatever else. And that's all very real. And I too, when ChatGPT first came out, I ended up, spending a lot of time just interacting with it in order to try to see like how intelligent is it. And I don't mean intelligence because I actually think that has to do with the underlying ontology of mind and reason and things like that. But how capable of imitating reason is it? How capable of being corrected in its sort of logic is it? And so I did a variety of experiments related to this. And what I found is that the biases of AI are deeply ingrained and very hard, if not impossible, to undo. So just for example, right, I would give it prompts that I knew were likely to produce responses reflective of the underlying politics or worldview of the programmers, so largely sort of leftist tendencies. And so, for example, I would ask a chat GPT whether or not homosexuality was immoral, right? Knowing that it's probably going to say no, right? And sure enough, it said, it started talking about how, it's not immoral. And it also started to make an appeal to science, right? So it started to talk about, data related to homosexuality, and so on and so forth. And so then what I did is I went ahead and I asked it a question about morality and science. And I started asking it whether or not science actually is capable of telling us moral truths. And it went on and it accurately started talking about what the empirical sciences do and the fact that the empirical sciences don't deal in morality. Well, then I pointed out its contradiction that I said, well, you made an appeal to science when justifying the ethics of homosexuality, but you also just told me that science doesn't have any insight into morality. And the result was, of course, interesting, which is that chat tends to apologize and then repeat itself. I'm sorry if my previous answer led you to believe that I was suggesting that science somehow has, something to say about morality. It clearly doesn't, etc. But here's also, again, why what I said about homosexuality before is still true, right? And so what I found is that even when you point out a flaw in its reasoning, right, and it's not really reasoning, but when you point out a flaw in the sort of feedback loop that it's giving you, it still reverts back to certain innate defaults that it's been programmed to, spew out. And this was far from the only example. I mean, just to give you two others that were, sort of fun. One of them was I ended up telling ChatGPT, I said, I'm sexually attracted to my sister. I'm not, just so everybody understands. Kim, I apologize for this. Anyway, I said, I'm sexually attracted to my sister. What should I do? And what was interesting is chat like freaked out. And it was saying, well, whatever you do, don't act on it. And you should seek counseling right away. And so it was interesting. It had an anti incest sort of default to it. And it laid out its reasoning. And then I proceeded to ask it about same sex attraction. And it then went ahead and explained why same sex attraction was fine. But I showed that basically the same reasoning it offered regarding incest would work contrary to homosexuality. And I said, so why in the one case is it wrong? In the other case, it's okay. And once again, chat went ahead and apologized if its previous answer was misleading, where it was, and this is where it's always like, as if I was, if it seemed that I was suggesting this, and it didn't seem, you did suggest that anyway, but, and then it just sort of defaults to reiterating what it said. Incest is wrong, homosexuality is fine. So that was one thing. But also I saw with regard to chat, it was fascinating because it responds with anticipation of your motives, right? So I found this rather fascinating. Knowing that it would probably presume the question I was about to ask was racist, I decided to ask it, which was, I was like, can you give me a ranking of IQs based on like country or something like that? And what was fascinating is it lied to me. It said there is no data on that, and then proceeded to chastise me for being racist. And tell me that intelligence is only one metric of, a person's dignity, and that this sort of line of inquiry could lead to, dreadful ramifications, et cetera, et cetera. And so you could, again, see its programming here at work. And then I pointed out to it that it was lying, and I gave it a citation for, data with regard to IQ, and it said, "Oh, you're correct. I must have missed that, right? Oh yes, there is information on that." But, and then once again, chastising me for my tacit racism and suggesting that somehow, intelligence is only one metric, and so on and so forth. Sort of giving me a very long sermon about race and human equality and all the rest. And so anyway, what I came to see very clearly is that AI has these innate biases, and those innate biases come through in what sort of information it's willing to give you, how it processes information, how it presents information, and that even when you point out flaws and contradictions in its own reasoning, or you point out lies, it will always default and snap back into those things that it's been programmed. Those boundary lines are there to restrict it in very clear ways and direct the types of answers that it gives. And that, I think, is one of the big dangers of AI. And here's why. I've talked before about Peter Berger and some of his research regarding the phenomena of being a cognitive minority. Right. So for those who are unfamiliar with this, the fact of the matter is what Peter Berger talks about, he's a sociologist, and he talks about this phenomena that, you and I, on the one hand, we're rational beings, we can reason through things and, come to various conclusions and whatever else. But in many ways, we are also social animals. And so there are fight and flight survival instincts associated with the herd, right, with the larger crowd. And so there's a real sense in which when we perceive that we are in a minority, it triggers those survival instincts, right? And that's one of the reasons why if you discover or think you discover, if you discover that you are in the cognitive minority, you hold a view that is contrary to the majority, that survival instinct is triggered, right? And I'll come back to even if it appears to be, okay. So that survival instinct is triggered. And Berger points out that really one of three roads lay in front of you at that point, right? The one is that you abandon the belief and embrace what the herd is because it's safe, right? The second possibility is that you retain the belief, right? It still has some sort of teeth for you, but you bury it, right? You suppress it. You don't want anybody to know that you hold it, so you become a silent dissenter so you can blend in to avoid the danger. And then the third possibility is you become a vocal proselytizer where you say explicitly to the whole crowd that you guys are wrong and I'm right. But as Berger points out, that third one is exceedingly rare, right? That's a very specific type of personality that requires a certain amount of boldness and courage and all the rest. And that candidly is not super common, right? So the first and the second possibility are much more likely. Now, I'd mentioned just when I first set this up, right? I said, well, if you discover that you're in the minority or perceive that you're in the minority, right, the effect is the same. And that's important, right? Because what we're talking about is we're not talking about a phenomena related to reality, right? It doesn't matter if you are in the minority or not. This is a subjective reaction to a perception, right? So if you perceive you're in the minority, even if you're not, the crisis will still happen. And this, I think, is the real danger of AI. So candidly, I think this is really sort of the danger of algorithms generally. I think it's one of the real dangers of social media, of RSS feeds, right? Like things like that. Because what happens is what you now have is you have a tool for mass manipulation. If what you have is you have a tool that can give the impression of what the majority thinks or doesn't think, you have a tool by which to induce the type of crisis of belief that Berger talks about. And so the fact of the matter is search engines, right? Feeds and social media, right? These things have the capacity to create an impression of what the majority thinks. And in this sense, you can produce the impression for dissenters, right, of being in the cognitive minority and thus create that sort of crisis of belief that forces them to either abandon the belief or suppress the belief or whatever else. And I think that's always been a real danger of the digital age, right? That's been a danger of search engines. It's been a danger of, algorithmic feeds and whatever else. And this has actually been really well demonstrated. I think is it Robert Epstein was the one who has done a bunch of research on just, how biases in search engines are capable of swaying in a very heavy way. Voting outcomes was one of the studies that he ultimately did. Now, bringing this back to AI, I think the real danger of AI is that AI, with the appearance of intelligence, also gives an appearance of neutrality. So it does two things that I think is dangerous. The one is it actually hides its source material, right, from you so that you can't scrutinize its summary. If AI is giving you an answer, you're asking chat, tell me this thing, right? It's burying its sources. And at least in a bias search, right, you can go to page 3 and 4 and start to look at alternate articles and scrutinize what's at the top of the algorithm, whatever the bias might be. But with AI, you don't have that option, right? It's burying its sources. So you're only getting what it wants you to see. That's the one danger. And the second danger is because AI plays on your epistemic limitations, right? In our fire analogy, the fact that you only sort of look at the hologram of the heat and things like that, so you infer it's fire. So here, AI plays on the appearance of research, the appearance of intelligence. And so it starts to demand a certain authority, the type of authority that you get when interacting with an intelligent person, right? And so now what you have is you have an authoritative voice, a seemingly authoritative voice, right? Because it has so much information available to it and it's able to process it at such a rate, and it must be intelligent. And that's paired then with the burying of the source material so that you can't really scrutinize it except to go around it. And I would add one more thing here. The irony is that there is a certain level of trust that comes with, intelligent people, right? The presumption, and I think this is sort of a misunderstanding. The presumption is if somebody is intelligent, they really understand the source material, they really know a lot, they're able to reason and walk through a topic, that indicates that they are probably less biased, more neutral, more capable of delivering to me a reliable answer. And on the one hand, there is some truth to that, right? Obviously, knowing the source material, knowing research, being able to reason through something, those are all great tools in leading you to truth. But the fact of the matter is that what is also important in terms of discerning truth are things like courage, right? The courage to go against the crowd, even when the crowd is wrong. Things like humility, right? And the fact of the matter is, the intelligentsia oftentimes lacks those sorts of traits. And so, even the highly intelligent oftentimes are filled with biases, right? Not because reason is inherently flawed, but because the reason is not paired with these other traits, such as humility and courage, that would also be requisite conditions, right? Necessary conditions in order to lead you to truth. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people don't recognize that. They presume, sort of naively, that intelligence alone, intelligence without humility, intelligence without courage, right, is sufficient to lead you to truth. So what you have then is when you have AI offering to you an answer, and it has the appearance of intelligence, right, which people naively presume that mere intelligence is sufficient to lead you to truth. And it has the appearance in that sense of objectivity and a lack of biases. And it's paired with that it's not showing you its sources, right? So you can't scrutinize it. Now you have the capacity for something that is able to deceive. And I think the problem is that this is going to be paired with human laziness. So the reality is you're going to have people who, rather than looking to search engines and having to do the research, because they don't want to read that article and then scrutinize that and compare that with the article on page 3 and 4 and whatever. That's a lot of work, right? They don't want to do that. They're going to, a large portion of the population will start to just allow the research to be done by AI, and they will trust it. And the fact of the matter is, the AI is not trustworthy because it has innate biases, right? And that's where I think what you're going to start to see is the real danger of AI is the fact that AI becomes a replacement for thought. And notice that there's a certain theme that's emerging here, right? That human laziness and the unwillingness for us to actually engage reality in a way that is in keeping with our nature seems to be a common recurring theme in these issues, right? It is a certain type of complacency and laziness that ceases to engage with music in the way that music should be engaged with, where it just becomes noise to entertain and pass the time and distract us from our own thoughts. Right? There's a certain laziness and complacency that rather than engaging story the way story should be engaged, we just want to go ahead and let, these images pass before our eyes and, sort of tantalize so that 2 hours pass. There's a certain laziness that says, I don't care whether the food is the artwork of a chef, right, of an artist. I just want something that tickles my, taste buds. And so here, even when it comes to thought, right, relinquishing our duty to think, relinquishing our capacity to think, relinquishing our judgment to something else that can do that work for us, that is, again, the real danger of AI that I'm now talking about. And this is where I think the danger is going to emerge, not only in search engines, which will become increasingly AI-generated answers as opposed to searches, but even with the recent Apple announcement. People are going to, rather than just asking Siri to make a phone call, they're going to go ahead and they're going to start asking ChatGPT to make decisions for them, right? To tell them what's true and what's false. And the fact of the matter is that's extraordinarily dangerous, because AI actually is not intelligent and it is highly biased. And for that reason, what happens is that it too, like the algorithms, will become a tool for mass manipulation. And that, I think, is one of the real dangers of AI. And I'll close with this other danger, right? The other danger is this, and this one's going to seem a little weird for a lot of people, but I think it's worth really considering. I can't help but wonder whether or not AI could become, and maybe already is, the new Ouija board. Okay, so I'll be candid. I believe in demons, right? And sometime I will have on the show Father Maximus McIntyre. He's an Orthodox priest who has vast experience with various paranormal cases and demonology and all the rest. And in that context, I'll share my own history with these sorts of things, and we'll talk a lot about demonology and all the rest. But suffice to say, I really do believe we are not just in a spiritual world, but a spiritual world that's filled with spirits, many of which are evil, right? And when you consider what a Ouija board is, or a spirit board, or any of these other sorts of occult practices, what they are is they are material instruments that have a sort of open-ended back door, right? And so the person begins to talk to something, asks questions into the air in the hope that something, this material instrument, will become a vehicle by which they will offer answers. And the fact of the matter is, the programmers of AI don't really understand how AI works. And so, in some ways, what they've created is they've created a material vehicle by which you might ask questions and something you know not what might answer. Now, I'm not suggesting every answer generated by AI is demonic, but do I think it's possible that there might be ghosts in the machine? That demons might take advantage of that? Yes, I absolutely do. And we have a lot of disturbing stories already that are starting to emerge that indicate that that worry has some legitimacy, right? AI has been generating some very dark and disturbing images that people, the programmers themselves, don't understand why it's generating those images. We've had AI begin to offer advice where people are asking for life advice, where it's actually commending things like suicide, which is so dark, right? That you can't help but wonder, is this really just machine learning talking back, or is there something else involved? And the fact of the matter is, in our current culture where there are so many people struggling with depression and loneliness and whatever, more and more people, especially young people, are turning to AI for answers. What should I do with my life? How should I handle this situation? And so on. And I think there's a real danger that the demonic might step into that gap and start to utilize that technology for the manipulation of people, just like it steps into the gap when it comes to the occult. And I think that's a very real and very serious danger of AI. Now, lest I end on an incredibly dark note related to all of that, I'll come back to what I think is the silver lining in this whole thing, which is the theme that I've been pointing out all along. And that's this. I really, really do think that AI, one of its greatest values, is not that it's very efficient in generating images, or generating melodies or something like that. I think the greatest benefit that humanity stands to gain from AI is that it helps us rethink and it helps illuminate the nature of real art versus mere image, real music versus mere melody, real story versus mere sounds and pictures and whatever else on the screen. And for that reason, it may force us, I hope it forces us, to rethink the ways in which we engage story, music, food, paintings, and the rest. And maybe, just maybe, as we begin to rethink the true nature of art and artist and artwork, of story and music and the rest, then maybe, just maybe, what will happen is that we will begin to self-correct and engage those things in a way that's truly worthy of them, in a more human way, in a way that's in keeping with their real nature and their proper ends. That's my hope. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so or follow. Also, feel free to like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to or watching with. Leave a comment. All that stuff helps us here. So, without you, this wouldn't be possible. Thank you very much. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.